Happy New Year, everybody. And Florida State got a treat on New Year's Day, and we're here to discuss it. And that is, of course, Fabien Lovett announced on Instagram that he is returning for another season, and that's huge news for Florida State. And joining me to talk about it, Florida State managing editor Ira Schofel. And Ira, first of all, obviously a little bit of a stink bomb last night at midnight when Jamie Robinson, some people thought, well, man, he might actually come back based on his tease on social media, but he announced just after midnight that he is going pro, and good luck to him. We talked about that if you missed the video with Corey. But then wake up this morning, and the good news with Fabien Lovett. I guess your instant reaction to huge news, especially for Odell Haggins and that defense, some additional strength and a proven commodity up front.
Yeah, I mean it's really been, for the most part, like you said, Jamie Robinson is the one guy so far who is a really key player on that defense that's announced he's going to the NFL. But it has been one announcement after another since the season ended of guys coming back. You know, you had the linebackers are both coming back, Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune, and the corners are coming back, Renardo Green and Jarian Jones, and several other guys have said they were coming back as well. But this is the biggest one so far. Fabien Lovett is if you had any questions about how important he is to this defense, just look at what happened in the games he was in there. I think they were 7-0, I believe, in the games he played. And, they didn't lose all the games he didn't play, but the run defense was significantly different. And part of that's because it's a big blow for depth. But part of it is, he's their best defensive lineman. Some people thought in the program that he was their best player this season. So even better than Jamie Robinson. So it's a huge deal for Florida State going into next season. It's not a total shock because we started kind of getting word the last couple of weeks that he might be coming back. But if you had told any of us, I think 2 months ago or the beginning of the season, I think everybody would have thought this is his last year in Tallahassee.
And if you notice, shortly after the IG announcement that he's returning to Florida State, Battle's End, had an announcement that he has signed with them. So, again, this is another instance where NIL has really come in handy for Florida State and bringing a lot of these guys back that normally, you and I know just a few years ago, all these guys, it wouldn't have been a question. They would have gone pro. And now he's coming back. And you mentioned those. I mean, you look at those splits and when he did and did not play and how much worse the run defense was when he wasn't out there. Now, I know some people looked at Florida. Well, I don't know if he was quite 100% in that game, Ira. But, I mean, what I'll ask you about, with the two big transfers they have coming in at tackle with Fisk and Daryl Jackson and Fabien Lovett back in there, and we saw in those last two games, Ira, he had Florida State won the last two games, but you were out physicaled in the trenches. You saw it against Florida and Oklahoma. How big is this for the defensive line, and what can this do for the whole defense as a whole? If you suddenly turn that position into a strength with all that depth and having 3-4 guys that really play at a high level.
Yeah, I mean it's everything. It really is, because what it does is it allows you to play, with a true front four and not have to bring as much pressure as Florida State did this year. Florida State a lot of times, they were successful as a defense, but they a lot of times brought linebackers, brought safeties, brought corners to create pressure. And now you've got guys that can get pressure the pocket up the middle. And I think that's the number one thing quarterbacks don't want to see. They can deal with pressure coming off the edge. They can deal with blitzes that they see coming. But when the pocket collapses in front of them, it becomes very difficult. Now they have to go to one side of the field or the other. It limits their options. It's just a big deal. And now, you're not just talking about 4 or 5 bodies. Like coming into this year, we felt good about the defensive tackle rotation because you had a lot of guys who had played. Jarrett Jackson and Malcolm Ray and even Josh Farmer had played some the year before. So you had some guys that had played college football before. But now you're talking about maybe 4 or 5 maybe impact guys on the defensive tackle. Fisk is a really nice player at Western Michigan, one of the top defensive tackles in the country at any level. He was at a smaller school, but he was a dominant player. And then Daryl Jackson, we saw him at Miami. We saw that was a bad defense, but when he walked on campus for his official visit earlier in December, he looks like an NFL player already. 6'6", over 300 pounds. Fabien Lovett coming back. I love Josh Farmer. Daniel Lyons, who was a true freshman this year, played some in the bowl game, and I think you see so much potential there. Ayo Tafasi, the young defensive tackle. It really goes on and on. You could see a scenario where Odell Haggins has 2 groups that are really staunch, really physical and athletic in the 2 deep. And then now you're putting those guys in the third team to get in maybe 20 reps or here and there where they're not, necessarily the impact players, but to have those top 4 or 5 guys, not just be guys who play, but impact guys, it's a big difference.
I'm glad you brought up my guy Tafasi, man. I've heard
Yeah.
some really
Yeah.
exciting things about how good he can be, and you're right, man. It's going to be, and it's so important for these teams at this level. The teams that play the elite programs have this 2, 3 deep. We saw that's one of the first things Jimbo Fisher did when he came in. He started getting those elite big players in there and building the depth, and you see that in those games. I mean, you play a ton of snaps. Sometimes at the end of the games, those 300-pound linemen can get wore out. But this right, he now Odell has the option to keep those guys in there, and there's not going to be a drop off. And then you mentioned some of the young guys. We talked about Tafasi. You talked about Farmer, Lyons. I mean, guys like that, that's great. You can bring them in a little bit here and there, and they're not going to be pressed into duty maybe when they're about a year away from being ready. So it's a huge boon for Florida State. Now,
And
Ira,
one guy
go
I
ahead.
did mention, I'm sorry, was Bishop Thomas. Also,
Yep.
he's not quite as big from a height standpoint as those guys, but he's really quick and athletic. Came in this last class. He's another guy I think that you can add in that rotation.
When they do these transfer portal rankings, they had to also factor in because I know they take away when guys leave, which I don't particularly like how they do it. They ought to keep the guys they keep too that did not leave. But they're again not looking at that. Ira, there's one big one left at this point. So we know Jamie Robinson, Fabien Lovett's staying now. I mean, there's that defensive end. And we talked about that defensive line, and I mean, this is huge for Florida State if they could somehow keep him. I guess first of all, what are you thinking for Verse, and then what's the impact if he stays and or goes?
Yeah, I think Jared Verse to me, I've felt, even when you started seeing the predictions that he was going to be a first round pick back in October, November, I was
Not
a little
buying it.
I was a little
Yeah.
skeptical of it just because it was so early.
Hmm.
And he is a dynamic pass rusher. But later on, the last couple weeks, you started seeing predictions where, okay, if he goes in the first round, it would be the very end of the first round, could be into the second round. So now, okay, well, that's a big difference. If you're
Yeah.
and you think about like last year, Jermaine Johnson, we were here and talk, he might get into the
Hmm.
top 10, and he ended up going much later in the first round. So I mean, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. And for a guy who likes school, Mike Norvell made a point to mention. I thought it was interesting during the press conference after the Cheez-It Bowl. He said he's loved watching the way Jared Verse approaches school. And when he said that, Jared Verse kind of nodded his head, like he's not. There are a lot of guys. You talked about this earlier with the NIL, there weren't a lot of incentives to keep guys in school because you couldn't make money in college legally. Now you can,
Hmm.
and so that's a big incentive. But when it's also a guy who likes school, this is not a guy who's like just can't wait to get. Look, I was not one of the people that love school. If you could have given me money to get away from school, I would have taken it. But Jared Verse apparently likes school. He likes college. I think he wants to get his degree. So I think that's a factor. The fact I think he knows he can be a lot better. The fact that I think he knows he could be not just a first round pick, maybe, but a definite first round pick and maybe a high first round pick. I think there's a lot of reason for him to stay. Now, at the end of the day, agents and all that stuff, maybe they'll sell the family on the vision that he can do all that if he tests well at the combine. But if I had to put my chips on it right now, I think there's a good chance he stays. That's not inside information. It's just like looking at the
Yeah. Yeah.
landscape. And if he does, I mean, this defense, you're bringing back almost everybody. Jamie Robinson's a big loss.
Yeah.
But you're bringing back just about everybody else. And then you're bringing in, some of these transfers, Daryl Jackson and Fisk up front. They're still in the running for Fentrell Cypress, which, we will like to see what happens there. The cornerback from Virginia, who's all ACC, he's a guy that they're in the mix for, and there's some other players as well. So, you just get the feeling that Mike Norvell and this staff, feel like this year, 2023, is a huge opportunity, and they're doing everything they can to load up for the season.
Yeah, I made a couple good points here. And if you go out to a practice, you see not only like school, he likes practice, he likes the football
Right.
team. He's one of the most upbeat guys out there. He loves his brothers. You can't fake that stuff because you see it out there every single day. So that does factor into it. Obviously, if you like where you're at and you're happy, you're more apt to stay. And I think your other point, Ira, of the guys we've talked about that have stayed or gone, I mean, I think Jamie Robinson kind of peaked out. I don't know really what else he would do
Right.
to improve his stock. And probably to some extent, Fabien, except he kind of had an injury riddled season. Maybe it helps him a little bit to come back. But I think Verse is a guy. Would we be shocked? I saw ratings as low as 4th round, or like you said, 1st round. He could go anywhere. If he ends up being a 3rd rounder, he's a guy that you can see. I mean, the sky's the limit for his ceiling. Imagine if he improves his technique, puts on a little bit more weight, and has a blow up season. He could go from a 3rd rounder to a 1st rounder. And you and I know that is millions and millions of dollars. And now with the NIL coming in, Battle's End gives him something, at least a little base, puts a little money in the bank. Again, these guys don't always make the most logical decisions, but it seems logical for him to come back for one more year and not roll the dice, not gamble that I'm going to be a 3rd rounder and I'm losing out a lot of money.
Well, and especially, the questionable decisions, sometimes you wonder who's around them and who's guiding them and who's pushing them in a direction. If we think back to when Jared Verse committed to Florida State, everybody at Florida State raved about the way how practical and how rational and how well thought out his decision was. His mother, he talked about his mother had basically a board in their house where the pros and the cons for every school, and they were meticulous with their approach, and they chose Florida State. If they're going to be meticulous with this, which I'm sure they are, and Jared has said they are, it just seems like a lot more logical to come back. But man, that's easy for all of us to say. We don't have the potential to make, the kind of money he could make if he went to the NFL.
Well, good stuff, Ira. And again, Fabien Lovett returning to Florida State for another season. That's a huge boon for Adam Fuller and this FSU defense. And we did a little preview there. Stay tuned to warchant.com. We'll have, when that news breaks one way or the other, we'll have it for you. We have 2 more weeks. The portal is open. So there could be mentioned Cyprus. Who knows what's going to happen here in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks, Ira. Stay tuned to warchant.com. And everybody, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.